Let's kick it off. So yes, so we are this is I think our final session on the subversion of the subject and dialectic of desire. We only have but 2-3 pages to read from the text. Um, and I want to spend most of the time discussing the full graph, um, as well as a few other ways to conceptualize the full graph. Um, I did recommend that we read the Sublime Object of Ideology, the chapter 3, I believe, on the vuoi, or which is curiously entitled Identity. And I think it's very interesting that, he says towards the end of the chapter that the Althusserian theory of interpolation from the ISA essay of 1970 only can think uh, the second part of the graph. It cannot think the fish hook. So therefore, it cannot think this retroaction, right? This movement of the subject back into its imaginary interpolation. And this is actually a very interesting way to understand the Lacanian theory of ideology as it contrasts from the Althusserian theory of ideology. In other words, it makes sense. And you could even argue, perhaps, that it's a limitation of Lacanian theory of ideology, at least for politics and social issues. What I mean by that is that um, there is an ideological investment on the if there is an ideological investment of interpolation on the upper aspects of the graph through enjoyment, particularly through jouissance. In a way, it feels to me, and this remains, of course, like the unanswered question, I believe, in Althusserian theories of ideological interpolation, which is how does anyone, or even how does a group, so-called talk back to an interpolation? This is famously dealt with in Jan Raymond's wonderful criticism of Althusser in his book called Theories of Ideology, where he shows all of these case studies of various like socialistic activity and communist activity, um, and applies the Althusserian theory of ideological interpolation to it. And he kind of shows that at the end of the day, the outcome is, at least as a heuristic for thinking liberation in a concrete sense, is fatalistic. But then, of course, he adds that the Žižekian version of ideological interpolation is even fatalism squared. It's more fatalistic. You're more subsumed into it. And moreover, you'll notice that one of Žižek's, he doesn't talk about it because it's too technical in his speeches, but in his writing, of course, is the theory of what's called the analytic, or not the analytic, he calls it the radical act. And you'll notice that at the end of the upper part of the graph that we're going to talk about today, where you get to the Bard's subject of the drive with the losange, with the cut in between it, that is the site, you could say, of the subversion of the subject, in which that battery, the mystery of the battery of the signifiers, which is first opened in the A without a bar, right, is then sort of, you could say, sort of like resolved through the operation of the drive. What that looks like politically is what Žižek calls the radical act, which is this libidinal act that, in a sense, shuts down the dualistic operation of symbolic interpolation as such. In other words, it famously, as he says, coordinates the foundation of the symbolic. So it's like a disruptive act. And then, of course, back many, many moons ago, Simon Critchley and him had this stupid debate about whether Žižek's theory of the radical act promotes violence or not, which is very ironic now that Žižek is such a profound centrist liberal. The idea of him being like it's the same thing that the Zionists accuse him in the wake of October 7th. It's kind of ludicrous. So anyways, I do think that the weakest point of Žižek is the theory of the act. And the most ambiguous uh, legacy of the sublime objective ideology is this ambiguity around what he's trying to resolve, not only for Althusser, because again, Althusser doesn't think above the K void, doesn't think ideological interpolation at the level of jouissance. Žižek does. I would contend that the next great task of Lacanian ideological critique would be to resolve overcoming ideological interpolation for the subject of jouissance. I don't think that's really been done. And I don't think that Žižek's solution is adequate, in my opinion. I've written about this. It's an ethical issue. There's a lot of things going on there, but anyways, that's a little side point. Let's dig back into the text. I propose, Matan, that perhaps we read.
I wanted to say, Daniel, regarding that brilliant outline of Zizek's sort of theory, because I think we got to remind ourselves that like Zizek in this text is very much invested in Laclau Move's thesis of the socialist hegemony strategy.
Mm-hmm.
And even though like he breaks off from them from that debate, and then he
Yeah.
like explicitly says that in his parallax view book, I think like with his Lacanian ideology that you pointed out, I think one of the sort of criticisms that we could put on him is the fact that he still falls in this sort of Laclauian Muffian strategy of reducing class struggle and Marxism just to a particular struggle or to a particular master signifier, thus not making it adequate for the act that he proposes. So I think there's this sort of like disavowal of his
Mm-hmm.
to the sort of
Yeah.
Muffian Laclauian view of hegemony, because this whole idea, what is it, of the free floating signifier that groups sort of latch onto, right?
Yeah. Well, I think it's also this notion of the Lacanian view of subversion has to do with intensifying the conditions of alienation as determined by a signifier that's imposed upon you, upon your group, or whatever. So, like the example that Raymond uses is South African, the very interesting post-apartheid South African context, where he argues that there was this like movement of poor South African blacks, but there were also Indians. And so it's multiracial. And the bourgeoisie had falsely racialized their subjectivity, preventing them from forging a solidarity with one another. And the only way in which they could invent a new signifier to rally around that would shrug off bourgeois ideology would be through affirming their status as the name of their campaign was called We Are the Poor. We Are the Poor, which was a signifier that was barred from bourgeois ideology to be uttered. And anyways, long story short, Raymond thinks that this is too empiricist for Althusser because it relies on their personal experience. So therefore, it's kind of not in line with this French rationalist, Bachelardian, Lacanian view. And so anyways, that's interesting. I mean, I articulate this in my piece. I'm kind of convinced by that case study, or put differently, an Althusserian has not come back to me and said that I'm wrong about it. So, I mean, maybe I am wrong, but I think there's something to this. You see my point. The Žižekian alternative, as you know from the lecture that he gave with our group, is suicidal. It's a kind of celebration of some type of you could call it a celebration of impossibility, but I mean, you'll see here in the Sublime Object, he has a very interesting reading of uh, the topmost part of the graph as the mother's desire. And I do think we should spend a little bit of time regarding Hamlet, because many years ago, I interviewed Simon Critchley when he was married to Jameson Webster, the psychoanalyst, about their very interesting book on Hamlet. And one of the things they argue in that book on Hamlet is that if you look here at the graph of desire, Hamlet is not permitted to become a subject of the drive. He stops at the mother's jouissance because the mother does not provide an answer as to the opacity of her desire. And so Hamlet is a story of a failed, there's no completion at all, right? Critchley says that Hamlet is a drama that reenacts a subjectivity of inhibition. So he's not capable of moving to the subject of the drive. And this is exchanged towards the end of the play, where he's trying to understand, I think, why the mother cheated on the father. And she basically affirms, it through, she doesn't leave open an answer as to the mystery of her own desire. So that doesn't allow Hamlet to develop his own freedom from that. So he's smothered by the maternal thing. I think that's a fair summary. But the Hamlet condition, according to Critchley and Jameson Webster, is more, according to them, more present as a clinical structure than the Oedipal dynamic. Because the Oedipal dynamic tells a story of something that would be a completion, whereas the Hamlet version is much, in some sense, more tragic. Anyways, I thought that was interesting. Okay. Any other thoughts on the general thing? I know I'm saying some general things here. I want to go back and we'll dig into, because I do think that Žižek's point about his whole summary is very good, and we can go through it piece by piece. I think it's useful to introduce this, because the graph works with all of these fascinating dualisms on throughout it, right? Ideal, ego, ego, ideal, and the way that all of that is that the imaginary itself is split between this sort of early symbolic phenomenal register and a deeper superegoic register instantiated through the voice of the parent. And that dualism pops up through the other three levels of the graph. It doesn't go away, until you get to the end. And the other thing I would say is that obviously one of the ways that I'm looking at this graph, as I think I mentioned last time, is that I think its aim is to sort of portray the end of analysis in a certain way. I think is one way to think about the graph. The core circuits and vectors that any analyst's hand finds themselves in an analytic case. I absolutely love the example of Socrates and Alcibiades from the Symposium. If you read towards the very end of the Subversion piece, because anyways, well, we can get to that. Go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah, I just wanted to share some really interesting things that I liked about what Žižek had to say regarding the graph, because he kind of tells us and reminds us that when we're looking at not only the graph but the direction of the signifier, is that it's not this sort of linear intuitive chain, but it's a constant retroaction. And we see in the elementary graph, which is Point de Capitan, graph 1, that it is the first form of retroaction, its logical form, and that we constantly see in these short circuits, specifically graph 2, multiple forms of retroactivity happening on the imaginary aspect of the graph, with this sort of short circuit of the ideal ego with the ego and the ego ideal, and then still trying to understand the message or the code of the other via the message. I think, from my understanding, building up to the graph, because what the ego ideal entails is also a unary trait, is that when we get to the subject of the drive, which encounters the barred A, I think what that allows us to do in this retroaction is for the subject to really see where the mark of the trait comes for. Because doesn't Lacan show us in building up to S barred A in Seminar 16, the Russell set, that this is not only the site of primal repression, but where the count is 1 and A come in, meaning the jouissance and the mark of the unary trait, right?
Mm.
And so I think, in this sense, we see not only the subject's mark, but the trait that comes from the other, right? The mark of the other, the bard of the other, right? Those are just some of my thoughts.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, I think there's a lot of very helpful elucidations, right? I mean, one of the funny things, though, is that the triangle that begins the graph on the bottom end with the originary split subject, because remember, like graph 1 sort of portrays the pre-history of the graph, as we talked about last time, and that triangle represents need. But once you move up to signifier in the first top left part of the triangle, and you move over to SA, the triangle stands in for what Žižek calls intention. And I found that to be interesting. In fact, in both instances, both at signifier, first SA, and then at jouissance, capital S, bard, large A, it's the intention of which I don't know. I was slightly, I thought that was perhaps strange in a certain way. The downside of his summary of the graph, I think, is that he does not, well, I guess he does actually. He does sort of provide a theory of the prehistory of the graph as well as of the imaginary. So I take that back. But again, one thing I'll point out before we go to the text is that in Fabio Vihi's analysis in the analyzing the Acree text that I talked about last time, at the time that this text is written by Lacan, the Subversion of the Subject, I thought it was interesting that the symbolic has more of a central role than does the imaginary. And in Žižek's Sublime Object, I think it's clear that the imaginary definitely does, which is a reflection also of the fact that he's analyzing this through the prism of the later Lacan. For example, at the end, he even says we could think of Bard's subject losange demand at the very end, at the very top part, as the Santome, right? So anyways, that's a little side point. Does anyone else have anything to say regarding Sublime Object before we jump in?
Briefly, just something I wanted to put a pin in that I found slightly confusing was Žižek brings up the signifier that represents the subject to the other signifier when he's treating the ego ideal. And then Lacan brings it up when he's treating the capital S bard A. And so I just didn't know to make it that. Something I noted and just something maybe to consider.
Yeah, that is interesting because Lacan's point is that the subversion that happens is a subversion back into the metonymy of the mystery of the battery of signifiers itself. And that, what is it? Something like the treasure trove of the agalma. Like in a way, it's like the dissipation of the object A in a certain way. And I really think that the example of Alcibiades' identification with Socrates becomes a very interesting point, because in that example, by the way, it's an example of Alcibiades not being able to fully overcome his transferential capture with Socrates. And I think that has something to do with the fact that he's not able to make a metaphor out of the phallic aspect of his identification. Because if you read the Symposium, of course, he's like conflating erotic identification and desire with Socrates. And so anyways, we can get to that point. I think it's a very interesting one.
I'd like to contribute to real quick to what Matilda was saying, because it is an interesting point, and I think it specifically has to do with Žižek's view on ideology. But that for him, this sort of subject that represents the subject, or signifier that represents the subject to another signifier located with the ego ideal, is because the way in which he operates with quilting point, and he thinks that quilting point relates to the ego ideal of ideology. And for him, an ego ideal is the virtual point to where the symbolic and the imaginary hook. And he explicitly reiterates this point in For They Know Not What They Do, where he says that the imaginary is already an inverted totality. And so it's precisely the symbolic quilting point that allows for not only the ego ideal to arise, but for there to be some sort of consistency with the topsy-turvy and Hegelianism of reality. So I'll just say that.
Yes, thank you very much, Luis.
Yeah, following that point, I was not very convinced by that chapter about that symbolic identification is identification with the ego ideal. I feel like that that can lead to confusion, right? Because I think that symbolic identification is more about identifying with a mark, right? With the unitary trait rather than exactly the ego ideal, because then I think it will be necessary to differentiate the ego ideal with the superego, right? To distinguish what are we identifying with, right? And to differentiate superego with the ego ideal as such, right?
So he says,
and just to finish, and because he
go
doesn't
ahead.
really explain what is a superego, right? And that maybe leads to more confusion, right? Yeah.
Okay. So you have identification with a trait of the other, which is sort of reducible to an A object, which is sort of how we remember from last time in a technical sense. The development of the object A emerges as a means for the subject to convert the anxiety and the pressure of anxiety from demand. It's converted into a concentrated point. So there's that, but then there's also a form of imaginary identification which functions as the double, what he calls the double of the subject. This is where we get this distinction between constituted imaginary and constitutive imaginary, right? In a certain way, one is the ego ideal, which is a reference to the symbolic meaning of Luis and his proper name, how he's placed, his class position, all of these more rigid ones. And then that's ego ideal. And then there is the ideal ego, which would be how we understand Luis through, for example, like what nickname we would give him, or like sort of what distance or relief we would give him from, I don't know, the pressure of rigid symbolic designation, i.e. it's like, I guess the imaginary, more so imaginary version. But then there is a gap between these two, and the gap between these two forms of identification is where the object A. So it's really like three operations in a certain way. There's ideal ego, ego ideal, and then the object A. All three have a theory of identification in a certain sense, right? And but once we get to this third one, that is the invention of fantasy. And I found that Žižek's conversation regarding and I think we should turn to this when we can even look at the graph itself. I found super fascinating and really like useful in a certain way. Like fantasy is basically uh, the means by which we both handle the same Hamlet problem, which is the mystery of not only whatever, like the basis of our heraldry of our throne symbolic identity, but like what the guarantor of our symbolic identity wants. So it's like the big other, the mystery of the big other. Fantasy is derived as a means to give a relief to the pressure of that on the one hand, but then on the other hand, fantasy invents what Žižek calls what does he call it? A substitute. It's a substitute object for that pressure, right? But in both instances, it's about getting a kind of distance from that opacity of the other's desire. And I thought his examples were very nice. Take Mamdani's mayoral campaign. Did you notice that the right is trying to, but failing, and you would have to ask yourself, why are they failing? To portray what Mamdani really wants vis-a-vis Islamism, vis-a-vis Muslim terrorist, fundamentalist, right? But it's interesting because that almost is seen as like a ruse or like as inauthentic. The mystery of the other is no mystery. There's no mystery behind Mamdani. There's no exoticism. There's no otherness that we fear. There's no anxiety that he provokes. And it felt to me like that's an interesting point apropos like some type of like statement regarding the perniciousness of the crisis that we find ourselves in, whereby those symbolic lures don't have any efficacy. So in that sense, like the ideological field is, you could say, de-intensified from having a hook, if that makes sense. Do you know what I'm saying? Like if we understand ideology as almost like this ruse whereby we try to interpolate people into a false mystery of the other, right? Ideology breaks down when you can't do that, when that mystery falls apart. Or just like the South African example, when the status of the subjectivity of the poor people cannot be reducible to what bourgeoisie says it is. We have to swap in a different X, a different mystery of our own subjectivity as a collective than that is being imposed upon us. I'm not saying that the Mamdani thing is going to be successful merely because bourgeois ideology is not able to exoticize him. There will be other means they can do, because there's other, like, I would even say more brute means that bourgeoisie can do that don't even rely upon that, because the exoticization is almost like an automatic thing that would allow for almost like a popular, almost like pseudo-spontaneous fear campaign, right? But what I find super interesting is that by and large, it's not working. And the reason I say it's not working is because I've seen it in the post 9/11 world. I've seen it really work. I've seen the fear of the Islamic thing really work. Now you could say in some rural areas it still works and so on, but I don't buy it. I actually don't buy it. That doesn't mean that we're like post-racist, but I don't even think this, but again, ideology in the sense is not racialization. Racialization, I think, would be something different. So those are some thoughts that I have for you guys after reading Sublime Object. My feeling is like, he's trying to, ideology is about swapping out that substitute. It's about that substitution process. And you know what else it is? It's also something like there's a fundamental contingency on the unfathomable X of our collective identity, our collective identification, rather, not identity. Our collective identification has a certain contingency. that's almost like a fundamental Lacanian point, I would claim, right? Otherwise we wouldn't have the capacity to do an act to subvert it. You know what I'm saying? And the other thing I notice here is that the transference, the theory of the transference in the graph of desire, did you notice, is what keeps the subject hooked to a view of the big other as basically non-castrated. In other words, the transference, it is basically, it keeps you at S large A. It keeps you at that circuit. It cannot fully go and address the upper part of the graph, if that makes sense. Which makes a lot of sense to me, at least.
Yeah, because it would keep you at the level that there is some subject supposed to know, right? In other terms, because that's the effect of the transference. But in the analytic orientation, when the question of what does the analyst want from me, that's where we get into the movement of the third into the fourth graph. Or to maybe even be more to put my cards on the table, when the analyst is able to scansion and punctuate, because then that would be able to enact the desire of the subject, like what does the other analyst want or desire, right? Because in the second graph, we just stay in this constant oscillation of trying to close that circle of SA and A.
Yeah.
Always a failed attempt, but it's the analyst and the analytic intervention that marks that moment via the parapraxis, this, forgetting of a name, a portmanteau, etc.
Yeah. I think it's interesting that Žižek says that fantasy constructs an object which has an empirical quality, but which has, again, been sort of unable to fully interrogate the interior X within it. And so I felt like all of this is premised on this notion of this deeply German idealist confrontation with the abyssal dimension of collective identification, right? And and again, I think it's clear why a lot of strategic thinking needs to be put into, like, if we take this seriously, if we take this upper part of the graph of jouissance and ideology at a collective political level seriously, I feel like there's a lot of work to be done on this, in terms of, because what it's really about is sort of, it's like an ingenious method for fighting back against phantasmatic capture, right? Or ideological interpolations that situate subjects, right? Luis.
I would like to notice that Žižek is giving his Hegelian reading in this chapter when he adds the section about Christianity, how Christianity is different from Judaism, right? Because I think that Lacan in this essay that we're reading takes more like a Judaistic position, right? Because he doesn't want to, or he doesn't propose any way to sever the black, right? In the way that in the Hegelian way, love is what closes the gap, right? One gives oneself to the other, as Žižek is trying to portray in the case of Antigone, right? Of the sainthood, right? Of course, Lacan talks about that in the case of perversion, right? And the symptom, right? But that's not a solution for him, and that's not like of heaven, right? Because he doesn't want to do dialectics, right? So I would like to point out, yeah.
No, that's a really excellent point. Thank you for that. I feel like there's a certain radicalism that he offers to Judaism. And that's why I think many Jewish intellectuals have really found Žižek a fabulous interlocutor. And you could even argue, I think you could make a kind of deeply psychoanalytic point, that the reason he was so falsely smeared as some radical Marxist, leftist, stupid, blah, 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 in the wake of October 7th, perhaps has something to do with the fact that he was able to develop a theory of Judaism, which is deeply actually emancipatory in a certain way. The way that he reads the Kevoi as the fundamental relationality of the Jewish community to God, I think is a really beautiful point. And then similarly, the way he reads Christianity is also beautiful, it must be said. Where I push back on Žižek is in, I guess, yeah, this theory of the collective act of subversion. And, but anyways, let's finish, and then let's finish reading. Matan, do you remember exactly where we left off?
Could it have been page 696? That's just where my bookmarker is.
Say it again.
696. Does anybody know if that's the case?
Yeah, that sounds right. That's right. Why don't we go and start with, we must keep in mind that jouissance is prohibited.
Okay.
And then rock it from there. And I'll stop sharing and we'll bring this back in a moment when you're done.
Let me just change my view so I can see if anybody raises their hands. All right, we must keep in mind, this is Lacan speaking, that jouissance is prohibited to whoever speaks as such, or put differently, it can only be said between the lines by whoever is a subject of the law, since the law is founded on that very prohibition. Indeed, were the law to give the order, enjoy or come, the subject could only reply, I hear, in which the jouissance would no longer be anything but understood. But it is not the law itself that bars the subject's access to jouissance. It simply makes a barred subject out of an almost natural barrier. For it is pleasure that sets limits to jouissance, pleasure as what binds incoherent life together, until another prohibition, this one being unchallengeable, arises from the regulation that Freud discovered as the primary process and relevant law of pleasure. It has been said that in this discovery, Freud merely followed the course already being pursued by the science of his time, a long-standing tradition. To appreciate the true audacity of his step, we have only to consider his reward, which was not long in coming, the stalemate regarding the heteroclite nature of the castration complex. The latter is the sole indication of this jouissance in its infinitude, which brings with it the mark of its prohibition and which requires a sacrifice in order to constitute this mark. The sacrifice implied in the same act as that of choosing its symbol, the phallus. This choice is allowed because the phallus, that is, the image of the penis, is negativized where it is situated in the specular image. That is what predestines the phallus to give body to jouissance in the dialectic of desire.
This is why also you could think the upper part of the graph, which he's pretty much elucidating or getting to now, is also a retroversion or sort of a return to the phallus as it is imaginarized. And I think that Matilda recommended some of the very helpful diagrams and graphs and sort of designs really in the lecture on Daniel Lagache's essay in the Acree, which might be helpful as well to understand the lower part of the graph as well as a side point.
We must distinguish, therefore, between the principle of sacrifice, which is symbolic, and the imaginary function, which is devoted to it, but which veils the principle at the same time that it gives it its instrument. The imaginary function is the one Freud formulated as governing object cathexis as narcissistic. I came back to this myself when I showed that the specular image is the channel taken by the transfusion of the body's libido toward the object. But insofar as a part remains preserved from this immersion, concentrating in itself the most intimate aspect of autoeroticism, its position as a pointy extremity in the form predisposes it to the fantasy of falling off, in which its exclusion from the specular image is completed, as is the prototype it constitutes for the world of objects. It is thus that the erectile organ, not as itself or even as an image, but as a part that is missing in the desired image, comes to symbolize the place of jouissance. This is why the erectile organ can be equated with the square root of -1, the symbol of the signification produced above of the jouissance it restores by the coefficient of its statement to the function of a missing signifier, -1. If it serves to tie together in this way the prohibition of jouissance, it is nevertheless not for reasons of form, but because the supersession of these reasons signifies what reduces all coveted jouissance to the brevity of autoeroticism, the pathways that are altogether traced out by the anatomical conformation of speaking beings, namely the further perfected hand of the monkey, have not in fact been disdained in a certain philosophical ascesis as pathways of a wisdom that has incorrectly been termed cynical. Certain individuals in our times, obsessed no doubt by this memory, have suggested to me that Freud himself belongs to the tradition of quote-unquote bodily techniques, as Mauss calls it. The fact remains that analytic experience demonstrates the original character of the guilt generated by such practices. Guilt that is related to the reminder of the jouissance that is not found in the service rendered to the real organ, and consecration of the signifier's imaginary function of prohibiting objects. Indeed, this is the radical function for which a wilder analytic era found more accidental causes due to education, just as it reinterpreted the other forms in which it took an interest to its credit of sanctification of the organ, circumcision, as traumas.
Yeah, so he's really talking about a lot of this Bruno Bettelheim initiation, bodily rituals, but that this operation of a sacrificial incorporation into the gaze of the phallus instates a kind of stain within the subject in a certain way, right? And I think Žižek articulates this pretty lucidly in his conversation on the way that the gaze functions, because I think this is sort of what's going on here. But he's making all of these sort of offhanded remarks to this Bataille theory of sacrifice, this notion of bodily initiation, And as I understand it, he's saying that this can all be understood through my theory of the signifier. That's my very, very crude summary, but go ahead, Louise.
I like when he talks about the penis, right? And he mentions that, of course, in the case of Freud, this is all, he makes a reference to penis, right? Well, for Lacan, this is symbolic, but nevertheless, there is a reference, right? Why Freud uses a penis, right? And there is a reference because it is penis, but it has a symbolic aspect when we're talking about the relationship that the erect penis has with jouissance, right? And how the erect penis is something evanescent at the same time, right? Something that is present and lacking, right? It cannot be an object present absolutely, right? It is always in the sense that you can only have it if you sacrifice it, yeah, right? So there is nonetheless in Freud, this is what my professor told me, that nonetheless Freud is not it was not so stupid to think about the penis, right? There is something in the penis, right? That of course has a symbolic aspect, right?
Exactly. I think that's very well said. And the way that it ends up in instating a position of negativity we'll get to in a moment. As we talked about last time, on the topmost part of the graph, it's negative phi. On the right, it's positive. Go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah, I mean, to kind of touch on what Luis kind of brought up, it's also interesting that, like, you know, even in as early as seminar 3, when he kind of vaguely refers to you know, the sexual non-rapport, he'll say that like there's nothing in the symbolic that could bring reference to what women's a relationship to sex is, whereas like there's this imaginary misrecognition on the level of men, which, you know, of course the phallus isn't, you know, synonymous with the penis, but it can in a sense refer or maybe be indexical to, you know, what makes a man a man. Well, what makes a man a man? A man is a man because he has something between his legs. Well, what's in between his legs? Well, what is between his legs is what carries man, right? The spermatozoa. And Lacan says this sort of circular thing to criticize like that in seminar 19. But I wanted to actually refer to, I think it was it you said Matilda referred to the graphs in the Daniel Lagash essay. And I think if you have the text in front of you, it's page 565. This is a perfect example to really illustrate, which is the optical schema, this sort of oscillation between ideal ego and ego ideal. Because again, what he says in the Subversion of the Subject brilliantly is that the ideal ego is the fixed image, right? And it will be associated with the minus phi as it will be the loss, right? It's the sort of imaginarization of the phallus or phallic function. And the ego ideal is not only aligned with unary trait, but it would be the way that the subject himself situates himself in the optical schema to be able to sustain himself through that plane mirror. And that plane mirror in the middle of the inverted image is the big A, right? So I think like, you know, this kind of allows us to see, minus the graph of desire, how the subject in the imaginary plane situates itself in the image, right?
No, that's excellent. And yeah, there was Matilda that drew that. Yeah, again on page 565. I think that's extremely precise and useful. And
yeah, because it's the inauguration of narcissism, Lacan's optical schema,
yeah,
full variation. But in the original one, which actually he has it right here on 564, it's just more sort of geometrical than it does show the actual bouquet. But in order for the bouquet to have the image of being right side up, it has to meet the rotation of the concave mirror, and it's a fleeting image. And so the whole point of ego or ideal ego is the sustainment fixation of that lure of the image. So the subject has to constantly move to be able to see that oscillation. But if there is a plane mirror, the instantiation of something within the big A, that allows for not necessarily the image to be fixed, but the subject to fix itself.
yeah.
Yeah. And that's the key of the schema, right?
Excellent. Matilda, please.
I guess I feel like broadly, like we're talking about castration complex and capital S bar to A. And I feel like the points on sacrifice were like about giving up a full, like a fullness of jouissance. And how sacrifice is related to that. Like we sacrifice the hope for a full jouissance, and the sacrifice is related to our symbolization of it, because I feel like, I mean, in my head, I'm like, oh, like maybe we symbolize something, we name it, like in that sense, it's like being sacrificed or killed, because like the word kind of kills the thing. I feel like that's a theme throughout this essay, is that like the word kills the thing or something. But the word persists and is like kind of undead in a certain way. And so
Yeah,
I'm just thinking
exactly.
about I'm just thinking about the dynamic of like get like kind of accepting the loss of a fullness of jouissance, or like maybe like fusion with the mother or something, and like the outcome is like maybe like a fetish or something, or a symbol of some sort.
Yeah, sacrifice does come up multiple times towards the end of the Subversion essay, and I think you're right. I think it has something to do with the way that the kind of mysterious Das Ding element in that element of the barness, or the X, the point of mystery of the other, is sort of transposed into out of demand and into drive in a certain way, and that this obviously, I think, is offering a type of relief in a certain way, because it's a relief from the pressure of the question of lack internal to the subject itself, right? And even the way that it's not only jouissance, but it's like the surplus jouissance of that demand. The drive is a means to exit that pressure, and that's actually interesting, because that exiting of that pressure is also a lessening of the ideal, a kind of taking the ideal, like there's like a very Lacanian point that like the realization of the lack of the internal to the ideal itself is liberatory, which is obviously something that's like so counterintuitive. But that is exactly the problem that Alcibiades has with Socrates, which he's not able to do. He's not able to generate a conception of the lack in Socrates, and it drives him crazy. But then there's also this issue of phallus in a very interesting way that we'll see in a moment. Perhaps we could go back to the text, actually.
Sure thing. The shift of minus phi as phallic image from one side to the other of the equation between the imaginary and the symbolic renders it positive in any case, even if it fills a lack. Although it props up, it becomes capital phi there. The symbolic phallus that cannot be negativized, the signifier of jouissance. And it is this characteristic of phi that explains both the particularities of women's approach to sexuality and what makes the male sex the weaker sex with regard to perversion. I won't take up perversion here, in as much as it barely accentuates the function of desire in man, insofar as desire institutes the dominance in the privileged place of jouissance of object A in fantasy, which desire substitutes for the barred big A. Perversion adds to that a recuperation of phi that would scarcely seem original if it did not concern the big other as such in a very particular way. Only my formula for fantasy allows us to bring out the fact that the subject here makes himself the instrument of the other's jouissance. It is of more concern to philosophers to grasp the relevance of this formula in the case of the neurotic, precisely because the neurotic skews it. Indeed, the neurotic, whether hysteric, obsessive, or more radically phobic, is the one who identifies the other's lack with the other's demand, phi with capital D. Consequently, the other's demand takes on the function of the object in the neurotic's fantasy. That is, his fantasy, my formulas make it possible to realize this immediately, is reduced to the drive. Bardes Losange D. This is why it was possible to catalog all the neurotic's drives. But the prevalence given by the neurotic to demand, which in an analytic movement opting for facility shifted the whole treatment toward the handling of frustration, hides the anxiety induced in him by the other's desire. Anxiety that cannot be misrecognized when it is covered over by the phobic object alone, but which is more difficult to understand in the case of the other two neuroses when one is not in possession of the thread that makes it possible to posit fantasy as the other's desire. Once we posit this, we find fantasy's two terms split apart, as it were. The first, in the case of the obsessive, inasmuch as he negates the other's desire, forming his fantasy in such a way as to accentuate the impossibility of the subject vanishing. The second, in the case of the hysteric, inasmuch as desire is sustained in fantasy only by the lack of satisfaction, the hysteric brings desire by slipping away as its object. These features are confirmed by the obsessive's fundamental need to be the other's guarantor, and by the faithlessness of hysterical intrigue. In fact, the image of the ideal father is a neurotic's fantasy. Beyond the mother, demands real other whose desire, that is, her desire, we wish she would tone down, stands out the image of a father who would turn a blind eye to desires. This marks, more than it reveals, the true function of the father, which is fundamentally to unite and not to oppose a desire to the law. The father the neurotic wishes for is clearly the dead father, that is plain to see. But he is also a father who would be the perfect master of his desire, which would be just as good as far as the subject is concerned. This is one of the stumbling blocks the analyst must avoid, and the crux of the interminable aspect of transference.
So I just want to say one quick thing. The unity of desire to the law, could it not also be thought as the question of the middle part of the graph to the top part? Law being the top part of jouissance and the middle being the first cut of the signifier, right? In a certain way, this question of the name of the father is also being theorized here. So it's like we have several things happening, right? We have, I think, a portrayal of the end of the analysis. We also have a theory of the name of the father as that which unites a signifier with jouissance as well. That would be like their function, which kind of takes us back to this Oedipal point he's talking about before about sacrifice and prohibition of jouissance as well. So anyways, a lot of this is dense because I think what he's trying to do also, as he often does in these, is condense down a bunch of his teachings all at once, right? So it's a bit overwhelming. Go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah, no, that was really good. I think, like, to also put it crudely, it's like to unite law with desire would be to plug the hole. It's literally being able to use the father's law to plug mommy's desire. Because what the name of the father and the law are that sort of signifier that stands in for the sort of unknowability of the desire of the other. And I like this point where he mentions about, like, men being the weaker sex, and then this about perversion as well. With women is because it brings up the question of sexuation, right? And the way that the big phallus sort of situates the two sexual positions. But it's like for the sort of the obsessional or the masculine, they could only relate to the phallus in the form of not having it, but also through the semblance of objet a and jouissance. Whereas for woman, and why she's not all, is because she directly refers to the phallus, right? She has a more affinity to the law than the man does. The man could only stay in this position of questioning mother's desire, but still need the dead father, right, as this sort of hope to complete that. That's the sort of technical Lacanian jargon to show what is at stake with what he's talking about as the two different functions, right? And why I bring up perversion is because in perversion, the pervert, be it like a masculine, still relies on semblance of little a, whether it be as the voyeur or as a fetish, and that requires the sort of lure of femininity, which the pervert uses her own femininity as a means for exploiting the other, right? The imaginary veil, let's say, the mastery of the imaginary.
Right. Yeah, that's very helpful. I mean, it does bring us back also in a way to the Hamlet predicament, whereby, you know, Hamlet is not getting the answer from interrogating his mother as it pertains to the lack in her desire, like the negative point in the topmost left part of the graph. That's not being accounted for, which ultimately prevents an exit, or you could even say a metaphorization. And of course, in Hamlet, the father is dead. It would behoove us to actually ask the question as to why the neurotic is in a weird position apropos the father, because in a certain way, Lacan says that they prefer the dead father. But if that's true, there's still some kind of inefficacy of the neurotic's function of the name of the father. And if so, what is inefficacious about their relationship to the name of the father? Anyways, Luis, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that what you mentioned before about if the name of the father is to be recognized between the two levels, right? I think he already mentions that there is no other of the other, right? And therefore the name of the father is exactly the fantasy, right? The fantasy that cool flows, right? Creates an imaginary or phantasmatic meta language, right? But it's still fantasy, right? And yeah, I think going back to the question of neurotic, I think that what the neurotic fears, right, is the anxiety of the other's desire, right? So being certain about the other's desire, that triggers the neurotic, right? And the neurotic is neurotic because he cannot confront her desire, right? Therefore, he needs to rely on this mystery of not knowing the other's desire, right? So we have, of course,
yeah.
The problem with the pervert. The pervert is the opposite, right? The pervert knows very well what the other desires, right?
Right.
And so, and the other thing that I want to mention is that in Lacanian, of course, with this Oedipo metaphor, it sounds very what is it? This called patriarchal. Yeah, patriarchal. But the role of the father, of course, is different from, let's say, a fascistic patriarchal society, right? Let's take Trump, for example, right? I think that Trump, of course, is not the dead father, right? Trump is precisely this imaginary other, right? To whom these MAGA supporters identified, right? And he is like the link towards, and that's why there is this aspect of historization of the fascist, like Nazi, Hitler hysterical acts, right? Of trying to bring back the desire of the mother, right? Trying to enact the desire of the mother, trying to protect this more homogeneous society, right? In which, as in the Žižek text, we have like the Jews and others are the ones that destroy the harmony, right?
Yeah, completely. I think if you study the history of like psychoanalytic, and there's a lot of different texts, psychoanalytic conceptions of fascism, in most instances, even in traditional Freudian analyses, as well as what's that wonderful text called Male Fantasies, which is both a combination of Lacanian and Freudian. I forget the name of the author. It's like a 3-volume work, an empirical study of German fascism. which is actually a study of the literature of fascist literature and things of that nature. His argument is very similar, that it has mostly to do as it pertains to Oedipal identifications with an identification with father figures as a means for the promise of a blissful submersion into non-castrated motherly desire, or like a return of. So in a sense, it seems to me that the fascist desire is wanting to actually go back down to SA, but SA not having to confront the excess, the X, the mysterious, what does the other want from me, and all of that, right? In a certain way, which is interesting because, like, if you saw this movement right now with the QAnon shaman, the guy who did the Jan 6th, right? He renounced Israel and Trump. And in a certain way, it would be very interesting to listen to, like in a Lacanian way, you would like listen to his speech, say in like a podcast now versus before, to determine the identification of Trump as father, how it might have fit for him. Because it seems to me that, the Lacanian theory of name of the father, especially in like its like later elaborations, is not so much about ensuring that some strong empirical fathers. It's actually about somehow the father function helps a subject resolve the impasse or the pressure of surplus jouissance on the one hand, but it also helps them to create some kind of meaningful mechanism to move from the pressure of the lack of the mother's desire. So I feel like the fascist subjectivity could never fully confront the lack in the mother's desire. That's in fact perhaps maybe where the causally speaking, where the violence of fascism could come about in a certain way. So I mean, there's a lot of ways of thinking about fascism, and I invite others to weigh in on that.
Yeah, I mean, they like to use the term motherland, right? You know,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
and I like looking at this graph. This, term short circuit, still applies right here in the upper graph, and I think this is where, like, at the level of fantasy on the left hand, really keeps the neurotic from encountering the lack in the other, because the fantasy is, as Sam McCormick, our brother in Christ, likes to say, fantasy is what plugs the hole in the other, but the reality is that the subject is plugging himself with the little a, right? So, like, he likes to say, like, the misogynist examples, like, oh, whose dick is this, daddy? This is your dick. But it's really, in the fantasy, he's plugging himself, right?
Yeah.
Where, the reality is that if desire is this trajectory from A all the way up to the formula for drive, it's retroactively trying to encounter that deadlock.
Right.
In the
I will share an example.
Yeah.
I will share an example. So in my analysis, I realized that my own father had snagged a signifier in his relationship to his own father over the word fraudulence, because, anyways, long story short, there was an event that happened in his life that led to a breakdown in his relationship with his own father, my grandfather, because somebody that he looked up to called his father a fraud without that person knowing that my father was there. And symbolically, that became instated as a word that was unquestioning. And so one of the strategies that my analysts and I had was to invite my father into analysis and introduce this signifier of fraud so as to sort of like demystify it, and therefore rehumanize my father's relationship to his father as no longer lacking in that way, but lacking in a different way. So the attempt was actually to dislodge a signifier which filled in the lack of the father and to replace it with something else, because what that signifier was doing was creating a bad demand upon my father, right? Feelings of incompetency, etc. Were you see the point? So dislodging the signifier in order to open up a new investment for a different direction of the demand. And I would say in some sense we were successful, even though the grandfather's dead. So he's actually a dead father. But I think this is a nice illustration of this point, right? About the negative, about the problem there. It's about accessing the element of the lack of the other, right? And I feel that oftentimes in a practical sense, we fill in, and I think you could even say that word became something like an object A. We fill in an object A solution, which actually is ultimately inadequate. And so I feel that like the analytic approach is almost to ask yourself like an inventory of your object A investments that fill in for these lacks, right? And ask yourself like, are they adequate? Or are they actually producing some kind of bad repetition, bad demand, etc., right? Anyway, so that was actually, now you guys better understand my advocacy and analysis for the inclusion of other family members. You see the point? And I'll say one final thing. In order for all of that to work, we had to first convince my father that psychoanalysis possesses authority. And we did that through two ways. One, he's an old conservative, and so he's like a credentialist. So my analyst having credentials mattered. But then two, I had to like tell him a few things about psychoanalysis and the unconscious that truly surprised him and showed that actually there is something like this works. It's not nonsense. And then once we primed him for that, then we primed him for dislodging that signifier, and he was like blown away. And now he's basically like a Freudian now. You know what I'm saying? It like worked. It was an intervention that really worked. So anyways, we can go back, Matan, I think, to the text. I don't know if that was helpful or if that makes sense to you all, but it certainly works for me.
No, I know. You mentioned a story a lot. I really like that. I don't know if Richard would ever think of trying to incorporate any people in my analysis. I don't know, he's on that grind yet, but I have noticed literally Lacanian theory coming up in my own analysis. And I had made a slip in talking about my dad, and I was trying to say watching him when I grew up as a kid, and instead I said watching him grow up. And Richard was like, watching him grow up. And then I was like, oh shit, yeah. But one thing I'll just say is, the name of the father is definitely a thing that's been coming up, because the name of the father is the name of my father. I am a junior. So there's a lot of weight that onto that name.
Right.
The sort of associations and the fantasies that I've been uncovering, and the sort of inconsistencies and deadlocks because of how he put emphasis that I have his name. And when I was saying, like, you have my name, you walk around and show some respect on my name. And because he was an ex-con and he was in gangs, and so he also had a father who abandoned them. And he was a con artist. Like, one week he could be a principal at a school or a substitute teacher, and then the next week he could talk his way into being a car salesman at a car dealership. And so he just ran his mouth and was able to get all these jobs by lying, and then also had multiple families. And so, in the sense, the absence of the father, the only way he became a man, quote unquote, as he would say, was through selling drugs with his uncle, who sold drugs for the Mexican mafia, or in prison. And so in the ways he established the law was through sort of or criminal activity.
Wow.
There's a sort of like, futility to that. And in the way I have his name, but I have no reason to do crime or anything like that. And you say, if you keep acting up, because I would get in trouble a lot, is if you keep acting up like this, the only way you ever be a man is if you end up in prison or in the military, right? And I joined the military. Never been to prison, but even joining the military, I don't feel like I'm a man. I have my own neurotic symptoms around masculinity, etc. But like in the way in which like there's these sorts of things, where it's like, well, you went to the military and he couldn't because he was barred access because of his felonies that he had during the time. So like there was some investigation around what does that signify? The only way you'll ever be a man is if you end up in the military or in prison if you keep fucking up mean. So there's like a lot of chains of associations that have been coming up.
It's really interesting, this function of the name of the Father as performing a kind of separation between signifier and jouissance, as the same act that we saw in Seminar 17 about the establishment of Moses and the law, and this notion of prohibition, and the whole question of like prostitution played a role there. So I feel like all of this is very interesting in a certain way, because it's like the Father's function is both a no to instantiate a prohibition, to instantiate the law, but it is also, more importantly, at another level, it is also a yes to the affirmation of what he said here, of the unity, of this unity. And I think what that revolves around is the notion that once a new signifier is inserted that can account for the lack in the other, that means that a new jouissance can be invented. Because jouissance doesn't go away. A new direction can be invented so as to make it more humanized or make it tamed. Like you kind of whip it and you tame it. Do you know what I'm saying? You don't, because there's certain signifiers that can kind of like fuck us up in a certain way. You know what I'm saying? And I feel like that goes back to this Žižekian point on ideology and contingency of naming. Insertion of signifiers actually means a lot in a certain way. Go ahead, Luis.
I was trying to say something else, but because we're talking about this, I was just watching a documentary about neo-Nazis in the US. And it's funny that the people there they are interviewing are ex-neo-Nazis, right? But the interesting thing is that they didn't change, right? I mean, their jouissance, their aggression didn't change, but now it's directed towards Nazis, like towards neo-Nazis, right? So there is this change in jouissance, but nonetheless, their aggression, right, is still there. But now instead of searching for minorities, they go hunt neo-Nazis, right?
That's actually very this is actually a very interesting point apropos the treatment of severe mental illness or even psychosis, which, like, if Lacan is right, in a certain way, it's sort of a solution to this over medicalization problem in a certain way, because the burden that a investment of signifiers that weigh us down, this is like a profound method of liberation in a certain way. Now, Lacan's calling that subversion. I think we should spend more time to actually understand what he is meaning by subversion, and even, of course, of alienation as well. So we should go back to the text. Pardon that digression, guys. Go ahead.
Just one thing, because I want to say this, is that, yeah, it sounds patriarchal what Lacan is pointing out, but it's symbolic, right? And there also in other texts, Lacan claims that the mother is another name of the father, right? So
I don't think wait. Who says that it sounds patriarchal? I'm curious. Like, what's the... I don't.
This whole deep. There are other theories that say, "Oh, Lacan is patriarchal." It's like, we say, "Well,
Like Judith
yes,
Butler.
he can." Yeah.
Does she really say that? Does she say that?
Well, yeah, she reduced. Well, not necessarily patriarchal, but that psychoanalysis is embedded with foul logocentrism, like
Oh, yeah.
the binary
Right.
logic. I think it's meant.
So we can understand it that way, yeah, but it's symbolic, right? And doesn't stop the mother to fulfill that role. Like now that you guys are talking about your family history. In my case, I grew up with my mom and my grandmother, and my mom took the role of like the father. She's very strict. She's very controlling, and she's like say the no against my grandmother. My grandmother was more like she took like the mother role, right? And my mom used to go work, and I didn't know her much because she was working, right? So she fulfilled that role nonetheless, right? So there is nothing that that adheres to some biological father, right?
Right.
It's purely symbolic, right? It's purely the fact that there is someone intervening, cutting the link, and saying the desire that binds you together is unknown, right? That's it.
Yeah, I like that, Luis. Thanks for that, because you're Hispanic as well, so you know that how castrating mothers and abuelas can be. You don't need to have the male present. They literally you do one thing and you're getting hit upside the hand with the chancla. So there's something very smothering and castrating about the feminine roles in Hispanic culture.
Yeah. Very, very good. Very good. Very good. My friend Matan, please.
Sure thing. Just give me a second to recall where we are. This is one of the stumbling blocks, meaning the father, the neurotic wishes for is clearly the dead father. This being one of the stumbling blocks the analyst must avoid, and the crux of the interminable aspect of transference. It is why a calculated vacillation of the analyst's neutrality may be more valuable to a hysteric than any number of interpretations, provided, of course, that the fright this risks bringing about in the patient does not lead to a breaking off of the analysis, and that the analysand is convinced by what follows that the analyst's desire was in no way involved in the matter. This, of course, is not a recommendation regarding technique, but a perspective on the question of the analyst's desire for those who could not otherwise have any notion of it. How the analyst must safeguard the imaginary dimension of his non-mastery and necessary imperfection for the other is as important a matter to deal with as the deliberate reinforcement in the analyst of his nescience regarding each subject who comes, or nescience regarding each subject who comes to him for analysis, of an ever-renewed ignorance, so that no one is considered a typical case. To return to fantasy, let us say that the pervert imagines he is the other in order to ensure his own jouissance, and that this is what the neurotic reveals when he imagines he is a pervert, in his case, to ensure control over the other. This explains the supposed perversion at the crux of neurosis. Perversion is in the neurotic's unconscious in the guise of the other's fantasy, but this does not mean that the pervert's unconscious is right out in the open. He, too, defends himself in his desire in his own way. For desire is a defense against going beyond a limit in jouissance. And yeah, I think we were talking about that limit. That limit is from a formally, conceptually empty self-reference to a self-reference that is formulated in response to something that is unknown. In its structure, as I have defined it, fantasy contains, negative feed, the imaginary function of castration in a hidden form that can switch from one of its terms to the other. That is to say, like a complex number, it alternatively imaginarizes, if you will allow me this term, one of these terms in relation to the other. Included in objet A is agalma, the inestimable treasure that Alcibiades declares is contained in the rustic box the figure of Socrates is to him. But let us note that a minus sign is attributed to it. It is because Alcibiades has not seen Socrates' prick. Permit me to follow Plato here, who does not spare us the details. that Alcibiades the seducer exalts in Socrates the agalma, the marvel that he would have liked Socrates to cede to him by avowing his desire. Alcibiades' subjective division, which he carries within him, shines through quite clearly on this occasion. Such is woman concealed behind her veil. It is the absence of the penis that makes her the phallus, the object of desire. Evoke this absence in a more precise way by having her wear a cute fake one under a fancy dress, and you, or rather she, will have plenty to tell us about. The effect is 100% guaranteed, for men who don't beat around the bush, that is. Thus, by exhibiting his own object as castrated, Alcibiades flaunts the fact that he is imbued with desire, a fact that does not escape Socrates' attention. For someone else who is present, Agathon, Socrates, as the precursor of psychoanalysis and confident of his position at this fashionable gathering, does not hesitate to name Agathon as the transference object, bringing to light through an interpretation a fact that many analysts are still unaware of, that the love-hate effect in the psychoanalytic situation is found outside of it. But Alcibiades is by no means neurotic. In fact, it is because he is the epitome of desirousness and a man who pursues jouissance as far as possible, that he can thus, though with the help of an instrumental drunkenness, produce before everyone's eyes the central articulation of the transference when in the presence of the object adorned with its sparkle. The fact remains that he projected onto Socrates the ideal of the perfect master, that he completely imaginarized Socrates through the action of negative fee. In the case of the neurotic, this negative fee slips under the bard's subject in fantasy, favoring the imagination that is characteristic of him, that of the ego. For the neurotic underwent imaginary castration at the outset. It sustains the strong ego that is his, so strong, one might say, that his proper name bothers him, so strong that deep down the neurotic is nameless. Yes, it is behind this ego, which certain analysts choose to strengthen still more, that the neurotic hides the castration he denies. But contrary to appearances, he cleaves to this castration. What the neurotic does not want, and what he strenuously refuses to do until the end of his analysis, is to sacrifice his castration to the other's jouissance by allowing it to serve the other. And of course, he is not wrong, for although deep down he feels he is the most vain thing in existence, a want to be or a one too many, why would he sacrifice his difference, anything but that, to the jouissance of another, which, let us not forget, does not exist? Yes, but if by chance it was to exist, it would enjoy it. And that is what the neurotic does not want, for he figures that the other demands his castration. What analytic experience attests to is that castration is what regulates desire in both normal and abnormal cases, providing it oscillates by alternating between the barred subject and the object of their desire in fantasy. Castration makes a fantasy a chain that is both supple and inextensible, by which the fixation of object cathexis, which can hardly go beyond certain natural limits, takes on the transcendental function of ensuring the jouissance of the other that passes this chain on to me in the law. Anyone who really wants to come to terms with this other has opened to him the path of experiencing not the demand, but its will of the other, and then to either realize himself as an object, turning himself into the mummy of some Buddhist initiation, or satisfy the will to castrate inscribed in the other, which leads to the supreme narcissism of the lost cause, the latter being the path of Greek tragedy, which Claudel rediscovers in A Christianity of Despair. Castration means that jouissance has to be refused in order to be attained on the inverse scale of the law of desire. I won't go any further here. Here's the end note. This article is coming out here for the first time, an unexpected shortage of the funds that are usually provided in ample quantity to publish the complete proceedings of such colloquia, having left it in abeyance, along with all the fine things that have adorned it. I should mention for the record that the, quote, Copernican, unquote, discussion was added later, and that the end of the article on castration was not delivered at the colloquium due to lack of time, and was in fact replaced by a few words on the machine, in the modern sense of the word, by which the subject's relation to the signifier can be materialized. From the fellow feeling natural in any discussion, let us not exclude the fellow feeling aroused in me by a particular disagreement. The term a human, which someone wanted to attribute to what I had said, did not bother me in the least. I was flattered, rather, as I had helped occasion the birth of the new element it brings to the category. I noted it with no less interest in the sizzling that followed soon after of the word hell, since the voice that pronounced it gave it a certain distinctive piquancy owing to the speaker's declared allegiance to Marxism. I must admit.
I think he's talking about Althusserian anti-humanism there.
Mhm.
Which would make sense given that Rancière likes to note that this lecture, which was given to philosophers, became hugely spoken of in the general Parisian, like, you know, Marxist scene at the time. Because, I mean, we should never underestimate that all of the most popular films, avant-garde art, everyone was Marxist. It's very hard to understand it, but everyone was Marxist, and the Marxist communist parties were huge, with tens of thousands of members, hundreds of thousands of members. So really a different time, a certain way, you know? And it's like so asynchronous to our own time, because like, oh yeah, like Marxism was somehow authoritarian. It's like, yeah, well, you're dealing with organizational problems that are born from the fact that it's a massive bureaucratic organization, you know. But the problem is that people try to import the 60s in France as if we live in it now, which of course we don't. Wonderful. Wow. Well, hey, you know, congratulations. We finished this text. Everyone should be, I think, quite pleased. I want to just open it up to see if folks wish to offer thoughts, interpretations that haven't been stated, unresolved questions that are here. I mean, I feel like one thing we did achieve is a greater fluency with the graph of desire itself, which I was talking to Stephanie about in my interview with her earlier today. And she's like, man, the four discourses are way easier than the graph of desire. And I guess I don't know if that's true. I guess that might, do you guys think that's true?
No, not really. I think the graphs or the discourses they appear easy, but often misunderstood. I think there's just so much saturation on it. That's like, it's annoying. I mean, it's the stuff that Paris and I have gripes with, but I would say that once you literally apply all the concepts that people already repeat ad nauseum to the graph, it starts to make a lot of sense compared to the theory of the discourse for Lacan. And I think the way we did it applied a lot more context to what's going on with the theory of the discourse compared to what most people talk about. You know?
Okay, got it. So Matan was terrorizing me because I've taught Plato to undergraduates, and I always pronounce it Alcibiades and use it with Alcibiades, which is fair, but I was like, oh my God. It's one of those things that like I'm never gonna be pretentious and like penalize somebody for making a mistake in how you pronunciate, because it's actually like a blessing that you know a word, but it just so happens that you have not heard it uttered in discourse. Because it's a sign that you actually did the work of the reading. But you know how pretentious it would be to penalize somebody for that. But I think, I don't know who's correct. I think it's all si, all su, ba, udis, all su. Maybe we're both wrong, Matan.
Well, isn't it also funny that like Aristotle is actually Aristotle or something like that?
We don't need to do that. That's too nitpicky.
I'm just repeating the ways of my father, I suppose.
What do you mean?
Oh no, I was just I'm blindly saying Alcibiades just because that was what came to mind, and that's how I've heard it in the past.
Okay. Oh, really? Oh, okay. Well, I looked it up on
Yeah.
Google, and I think that My version's closer, so I win. No, I'm just kidding. I think it's not, but the whole point that he's making here is actually quite nice. Because have you guys read this part of the symposium? Alcibiades is trying to like get with Socrates. So it's like this whole point about yeah, like reason must have a subtraction from the erotic and from the sensual. And I think that Lacan's point is that in a way, I feel that his point is that the investment into the object A of the agalma of Socrates remains caught within the top left part, the negative part, but he's not capable. Then the question is like, is that because he's not able to make a metaphor out of the phallic trait in his identification with Socrates because it is overly eroticized or overly sexual? That's my interpretation. Matilda, I don't know, you can jump in with a comment. It doesn't need to be related to that, but
I didn't have anything that follows up directly on that, but I did want to speculate about the end of what we just read. I was kind of struck by like the neurotic is like greedy. Is the neurotic greedy? Is that what's like the neurotic like won't? I'm just repeating the text. I don't really get what it means, but the neurotic, he says, the neurotic won't sacrifice its castration to the other. And because the neurotic feels like the parents demand castration. And I just wondered about when guilt was brought up, like quite a long page, a few pages back. It seems like that same like thing, like the other doesn't exist. And so like, I felt like the guilt theme kind of came back momentarily as we're talking about the neurotic. That was kind of my question. Is this an ethics here? Like, I don't know.
yeah.
It ends pretty speculatively, I guess. That was just what I wanted to say.
Yeah, I guess Alcibiades is a neurotic in a way because he refuses the separation between the uncastrated perfect philosopher master with desire or like, but desire as again as phallicized, or sort of like, yeah, it's like something about identification with mastery has to also be defallicized is one way to think about it. And that the neurotic's problem is that they're not able to make the movement as we see on the screen from the negative to the plus, meaning that they're like caught within the field of the other in a certain way, or like they're still riddled by the X of the other, if that makes sense, you know? I feel bad for the neurotic. Like they're like the least free. Like, you know, but maybe they want to be free. It's a very, neuroticism is actually a very painful condition in this way. Andrew.
Yeah, I mean, I want to touch on what you were saying about Alcibiades and this sort of inability to create a metaphor for the phallic trait, if I recall verbatim.
I think that's what he's saying, yeah.
Yeah, and well, first of all, Rosichner, because I'm going to bring him up twice, mentions that for Freud, neurosis is a technique to deal with suffering and the fact of unpleasure. But this whole thing about the inability to create a metaphor for that trait would then make him not neurotic in the sense, but almost kind of like he would be neurotic in the sense of when you look at like the way he's coming onto the agalma and relates only to Socrates via the agalma. But it's bringing up the whole thing about the anti-descriptive descriptive argument that Žižek was talking about and the contingency of names, because for him, right, and I think this is pretty aligned with Lacan, with floating point and metaphor, but with ideology, of course. But that metaphor allows for a substitution of the sliding of all these metonymic things going on.
Yes.
And so when he says, like, for Atali, fear of God is the substitute for all other metonymic fears.
Yeah.
Like for a German identity, all other despairs and pitfalls are quilted by the Jew, right? The signifier of the Jew is the quilting point for all that and creates a metaphorical substitution. And I wanted to tie this in with this notion of not the -phi as underneath neurotic, because what the -phi, if I recall correctly, is tied in with is the loss of the sort of idealized image, the fixed image of the ideal.
Exactly, which is
yeah.
why the identification with Socrates is not facilitating that for Alcibiades.
Right.
If anything, it's only keeping him mired in the imaginary wholeness of his own narcissism in a way.
Yeah.
So like, which is tragic because, and it's very interesting also, this whole point about Socrates' face is ugly, Socrates as the stranger, Socrates as outsider, Socrates as other, as a heuristic of his anti-transference.
Absolutely. Yeah,
as
absolutely.
a technique, right?
Yeah.
It's like necessary in a certain way, right?
Yeah, I think like with why I'm interested in this like point,
and it goes back to the ideal ego thing that Elizabeth was talking about in Discord too.
Yes. And I think to drive this home, because I got to have to leave soon. Sam McCormick brings this perfectly about like, this -phi thing, and this is aligned with also Freud as well, as this return to Edenic bliss or a narcissistic blissness.
Yes.
And Rosichner, again, when he talks about the Romain Rolland dialogue with Freud about religion and why religion is valid, because it's this sort of faculty of feeling oceanic oneness. But then Freud retorts and is like, oh no, this is actually just not because this is validating religion itself as a human faculty, but this is actually indicative of a desire to go back to Edenic bliss. And in a sense, ideology as the -phi, or not trying to say ideology is -phi, but the function of ideology as religion, as well as religion, have this thing of like the return to. So I think there's something of a narcissistic return to Edenic bliss or oceanic oneness,
right?
You see happening in the neurotic, but is incapable of doing that.
Right. It's like the philosopher is the one who can promote the subject's flourishing with knowledge of their split subjectivity, like with a new knowledge of it, and then set them off in a new direction to live with it in a certain way, right? It's about the but it's also, I think, also frankly about the effacement of the battery of signifiers that one had invested in. I think I insist that it's also about a new investment in a new regime, right? A new regime of signifier investment has to take place. Which is why I think, again, this really tells the story of the whole analytic experience is portrayed in this graph. It's remarkable how much is here. So much.
All right, I gotta head out, everybody. Great work.
Sounds good, Andrew. Thank you so much. Yeah, great work. Oh, hello there, Ellie. How are you?
Hi, I'm good. How are you?
We're great. We are great. I think we might be in a position to close unless there's any burning thoughts or questions. I'm extremely happy that we finished this text. It feels uncanny that we finished it. It's like, wow, we did it. Now the question is, what's next? We need to brainstorm what that might be. I feel like maybe we would benefit from doing something again from the Ikri. Because every time you do something from the Ikri, you you have to add all this structure, this like it's all very. Matilda, what are you thinking in terms of a next text?
I mean, Science and Truth is right
Science and
next
Truth
door. It's right next door to here, and it's not very long.
is right next door. We can call it
Yeah.
up.
Yeah.
Very nice.
I was going to
That's
say
a good
that one.
suggestion. Go ahead, Elizabeth.
Matilda, I was going to say that one too, especially insofar as subversion of the subject comes into play.
Yeah,
I agree.
I think we would benefit from that a lot. I think we should do that 100%. Maybe even as soon as next Thursday, if you guys are up for it. Wonderful. Well, look, Matan, you are the man for doing the reading. Thank you so much. Thank you. Akshay, we didn't hear from you today, but I hope that you have benefited from this. Jonas, Daniel, Nicholas, thanks for joining. I will post all the videos. I guess we have 4 videos after this one. I'm not going to post them as videos. I kind of prefer to do it just as audio, like we did with the Kant with Saad. I think it's a little bit better. We'll do it that way. Although, actually, no, we can't do that because there's so much visuals. We might need to post the videos. Sorry. Anyways. Oh, yeah, the interview with Stephanie went really well. It's super interesting. I don't know if you guys knew this, but she also has written a standalone book. Her first book is just all on the theory of perversion. Yeah, so we talk quite a lot about that. She really knows her stuff quite well. And we also talk about like a lot of her insights from being an analyst and like new symptoms that she's hearing and things like that. It's pretty interesting. So, okay, great. Any final thoughts before we? All right. Okay. We shall close. I hope you guys have an excellent end of the week. All the best.